The rate at which food prices in South Africa are rising remains at softer levels. We now have the inflation data for April 2026, and it shows that food prices were rising at a softer pace at about 2.8% from 3.4% in March 2026. This is all because of the large domestic agricultural production. If you look at how much fruit we have produced this year, the grain production, all of these are the key contributing factors to this lower pace of food prices in South Africa. And of course, the base effects on the meat side, because in the livestock and pork producers industry, we still have some challenges. We continue to struggle with the foot and mouth disease in the cattle industry, as well as the avian influenza in the pork industry. But of course, when we have some of these diseases, one of the difficulties is that we can't access export markets. That puts pressure on the producers. But for the consumer side, it also means that although slaughtering may decline, but there gets to be some decent supplies of the product for the local market. But remember also within the meat story in South Africa, sometime last year, we had temporarily banned the poultry imports from Brazil because they were struggling with avian influenza there. And after a period, we reopened those imports. That happened at the same time when the stories around the animal diseases were coming out in South Africa. And the consequence of that was this jump in the meat prices. Now, that is playing as a base effect this time around, which is why when you look at the numbers of the inflation data, you'll see that mid price inflation is starting to soften. There's a base effect story playing in there. But if you look at the fruits are actually on deflation, which means the prices are really declining. It's not just the rate at which food prices are changing, but the prices are declining. And the core thing about that is because we have a lot of fruits. Either you're talking to folks in stone fruit, you're talking to folks that were in table grapes, and the citrus farmers now, we are entering the harvest period. And of course, certain regions of the Eastern and the Western Cape, they experience devastating floods. And we are still trying to understand how much impact of all of those will. And infrastructure in certain farms and even the fields in some farms, they've been devastated by this. But I think at a national level, that still doesn't change the fact that we are in a year of abundance in fruit output, and we will still continue to participate in the export markets. And as much as we will be exporting, we'll still have a lot for the domestic market. And I think this inflation data begins to tell us that story then, because fruit and vegetables are in deflation. We had struggled with floods in the northern parts of the country and the eastern parts of the country earlier in the year, but that was after people in potatoes and the other products had already harvested, which is why you see that even on our vegetable side, the numbers are looking great. There are ample supplies in various fresh produce markets across the country. It speaks to that. In the grains component, the first thing to know is that we still import about half of the wheat we consume in South Africa, but there's a lot of wheat in the world market. Global wheat production is at a record level, around 845 million tons of wheat that is produced in the world, and that is putting pressure on global wheat prices, and we are benefiting with that as consumers. But of course, it has a opposite impact for those that are the wheat producers, which is why we typically talk about a tariff that balances the consumer welfare as well as the dynamics for the farmers in South Africa. But the point for this commentary of inflation is that that ample global wheat supply is helping. But locally, we also have large grain. All of our summer grains and all seeds, they are expected to be around 20.8 million tons that we produced this year, up 1% from last year, but record harvest in maize, record harvest in soybeans. And you see this in the prices that are under pressure. Maize prices are down by anywhere between 20 to 30%. Soybean prices are down by anywhere between 10 to 15%. And all of this speaks to these ample supplies that are available. And when you're looking at this inflation data, it mirrors that. Of course, fuel remains a core issue, because about 80 to 90% of our grains and agricultural products are transported by road. So that remains an upside risk on inflation going forward. But I think that those that are distributors and the others will, to a certain extent, absorb some of these. But it's also at a time where fuel prices is going up, but agricultural commodity prices are coming down. So to an extent, there's a little bit of offsetting in some products here and there, which is why the overall food price inflation story remained this constructive. The other risk, though, going forward is a story of an El Nino that we've been talking about. But that will only be clear on the food price inflation data in 2027, because remember, it is only important for the next season, the 2026-27 production season. But looking at the data that is coming up now for April, it shows that South Africa's consumer food price inflation is at its lowest level in 14 months. And this is thanks to the ample grain supplies that we have and the ample fruit and vegetable supplies we have, as well as those base effects in the meat side. So the core message is that the food prices in South Africa are still increasing at a much softer pace than we had feared. And of course, in other parts of the world, people are already as worried about food prices. So this thriving and robust domestic agricultural sector that we have is helping a lot in times like this. And of course, I know that for the folks in the farming sector, there's all the cost pressures and the difficulties that they experience. But for this video, on the purpose of a consumer side, looking on that perspective, and I think that we are seeing those gains through this data that Statistics South Africa released today on May 20th, telling us about what the inflation data is looking like for April 2026.